Well, over the last month, our congregation has been looking at the stories of Christmas as found in Matthew and Luke's Gospel through the lens of Hollywood Christmas movies. And so each week, and all of them you would have known the movies, each week we've looked at the movies to see in what ways do they point towards the real meaning of Christmas. And today we reach the climax and conclusion of this series of sermons as we look at Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And of course, the Christmas Carol was written, published in December 19th of 1843. And it was an instant hit among the readers. And over time, especially when we come into the movie age, there have been over 100 adaptations of this novel turned into film. You've probably seen many of them. I was talking with my granddaughter this morning. She spent the night last night. We were snuggling together as we were getting up, and she said, she ran into the bedroom and sitting there with Lavon and I, and she said, Pop, what are you preaching about on Christmas Eve? And I said, well, of course, the birth of Jesus, but I'm also going to be talking about A Christmas Carol. And she said, which version? And I named a couple of them, and she'd never heard of those versions. But she asked if I was going to talk about Spirited, which just came out this year, and that was another version of the Christmas Carol. And then she named another one I'd never heard of before. So 100 versions of these. The very first one was 1901. It was one of the first one of the first silent movies. And that entire movie on the Christmas Carol was 4 minutes long. You're going to see a clip from it towards the end of the sermon. And anyway, so all of these adaptations, and there was ballets made of it, and there was operas that were written for it. And so we're going to talk about A Christmas Carol tonight. And as we do that, our aim is going to look through the Christmas Carol to see the real meaning of Christmas. And as we do that, I want to remind you of the protagonist in A Christmas Carol. So you may, well, I know you know his name. What's the guy's name who was the lead character in A Christmas Carol, was bad and then became good? What's his name? Exactly, Ebenezer Scrooge. So Ebenezer, I want to talk about his name for just a minute, what it means, because that's sort of the frame for our sermon today. So Ebenezer is a Hebrew word. It shows up 3 times in the Bible. Samuel, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament, and judges of the Old Testament, is the one who uses the name, and it means stone of help. So Ebenezer means stone of help. What does it mean again? All right, I want you to remember this after you go home. So Ebenezer means stone of help. And here's when he used it the first time. As the Israelites were fighting the Philistines, their dreaded enemies, the Philistines, they were quite afraid of them, and yet they ended up with the upper hand in battle, and they defeated the Philistines, and the Philistines fled off of the Israelite territory. And when that happened, Samuel took a big rock, and he put it in the middle of a field, and he said, this is our Ebenezer, our stone of help. It's a sign that God helped us when we were in deep trouble, that God delivered us. And then when Israelite and later Jewish parents would name their children Ebenezer, what they meant, it was a name of promise. They meant that they hoped that their child would grow up to be a stone of help for other people, that they might even be a sign of God's love and care for other people. So they would love and care for people. They would do justice and love kindness. They would love their neighbors as they love themselves. All of this was a part of the hope if you gave your son the name Ebenezer. So Ebenezer means excellent. Look at that, you learned Hebrew already. So stone of help. Then his last name was Scrooge. Now Scrooge comes from an archaic English word, screws, S-C-R-U-Z-E, screws, and it meant to squash or to crush or to apply pressure to something. And so the word screws becomes the word screw, in which you screw a screw into something and you attach it together, but it also, that word is sometimes used to describe, putting pressure to somebody. And so this word is not really a positive word. It's actually a pretty harsh word. So interestingly enough, he has the name Ebenezer, which means stone of help, and he has the name Screws, and we'll just use one word for it. We're going to say it means to crush. So Screws means crush. So Scrooge is crushed. So he has these 2 names. Charles Dickens does this on purpose because he wants us to see the battle that's going to go on inside of this man between one who would be an Ebenezer, a stone of help, and one who is a Scrooge, who would end up crushing other people, applying pressure to them unnecessarily. All right, and here's what we want to know is Charles Dickens does that because he wants us to know that there's both an Ebenezer and a Scrooge in all of us. There is the one who wants to help and bless and do the right thing and the compassionate thing, and then there's the one that, if fed just a little bit, begins to apply pressure, begins to crush, to oppress, to hurt, and bring pain to other people. And the question, of course, that we're meant to ask when we read Dickens' Christmas Carol is, which are we going to be? An Ebenezer or a Scrooge? All right, so with that in mind, I want to take you to see a picture of Ebenezer Scrooge towards the end of his life. He started off as an Ebenezer, really a good guy, but he ends up, by the time the story's told, to be a real Scrooge, and somebody who's just harsh and unpleasant and unkind. So I want to show you a film clip from the 1992 adaptation of A Christmas Carol. It's the Muppet Christmas Carol. Take a look.
Merry Christmas, Uncle Scrooge. God save you.
Merry Christmas. Hamburger.
Quick, it'll be warmer in there.
Christmas a humbug, Uncle? Oh, you don't mean that, surely.
Actually, I think it's colder in here.
Merry Christmas, you say? What right have you to be merry? You're poor enough.
What right have you to be dismal? You're rich enough.
He's got him there, the old boy's speechless.
If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips would be cooked with his own turkey and buried with a stake of holly through his heart.
Well, not quite speechless.
Oh, Uncle.
Nephew, you keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine.
Christmas is a loving, honest, and charitable time. And though it's never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that Christmas has done me good and will do me good. And I say, God bless it.
And how does one celebrate Christmas on the other?
Little light up here? Or not? There we go. A little more, maybe? Thank you. All right, so wouldn't you love to have that guy as your boss? I mean, you know, and here's what Scrooge really represents. He's a caricature of someone who is self-absorbed, cheap, graceless, someone who felt no responsibility for his fellow human beings. And he resented the fact that he had to give Bob Cratchit, his employee, the day off at Christmas and to pay him for it. He thought that was just absurd. Anyway, that's Ebenezer Scrooge by the time we get to his story in A Christmas Carol. And here's the bad news. The bad news is, once more, there's a bit of Ebenezer Scrooge in all of us. We can be cranky and irritable and unpleasant. We can ignore the needs of other people. We can be apathetic and indifferent to what happens in our world. We can be uncharitable and crushing people sometimes. And that's part of what we're meant to recognize in the story. I think of Elie Wiesel's words when I think about Ebenezer Scrooge's indifference to the needs of other people. And Wiesel said this: the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. By the way, I was at Operation Breakthrough a couple times the last couple of weeks, and it exists at 31st and Troost. You'll find out more about it at the end of the sermon. But there's a preschool there for 405 children who are children of working poor parents or grandparents, and they've lived tough lives, and it's a really hard place. The community and the kids have had tough lives. And the preschool is a pretty amazing place. It's only like 30 minutes from here. And as Mary Esselman, the director and president of Operation Breakthrough, and I were talking, she was telling me about some of the kids. And she said, I gotta tell you, we interviewed these 8 children to tell their stories, and they were just, they were just telling their stories. They didn't think it was a big deal. In fact, they thought it was pretty normal. And she said there was a 3- and 4-year-old who just broke my heart as they were talking about how their mommy's given them hiding places to hide when the shooting starts in their neighborhood. 30 minutes from here. And indifference is when we think about that. Actually, try not to think about it. We live in, some of us, many of us live in the southern part of the city, and as we do, we don't have to see that, think about it. We don't really want to think about it. That's indifference. And that's what Scrooge is like. And so when we think about an Ebenezer is a stone of help, and we're thinking, okay, if we're an Ebenezer, we actually care about those kids. And we care about, other people who are walking through darkness, that we might be a part of helping them find light in our own lives, but in their lives. And so this is the kind of way that we are. We try to be good people. And I know most of you, or many of you here, you're really wonderful people. I'm proud of you. But I know in my own heart, there are times I struggle because I don't want to see things. I'd rather pretend that they don't exist. And that was Ebenezer Scrooge. He didn't even try to pretend, just ignored it. Anyway, so here's what happens. In the story, the goal is redemption. The goal is to transform this person who had become a person of hate, and well, you saw him up there, into somebody who was a loving human being, to move Scrooge back to being Ebenezer again. And every great Christmas story is a redemption story. No matter what film you look at, if it's a Christmas story, it's probably a redemption story. And when we look at the Christmas story, the real Christmas story, it's a redemption story. It's about how God came to us in a baby, born in poverty, who came to rescue us, to save us, to deliver us, to help us, to remember who we are and what it means to be human, so that we might be changed, so that we might choose to be more of an Ebenezer than a Scrooge. All right, so the first spirit or ghost of Christmas that comes to visit him on Christmas Eve night to redeem him is the ghost of Christmas past. And you may remember he takes him back to his childhood. Because typically when people have become really miserly and uncharitable and unkind and uncaring, it relates back to something that happened in their childhood. Maybe they had a horrible experience, some painful thing that turned them away from God and life and turned them towards a sort of absorbed existence. And so the angel or the spirit or the ghost of Christmas past takes him to see him in his childhood. When he was a kid, he was a teenager maybe a little younger than that. And he was at a boarding school, and all the kids went home for Christmas, but his dad never sent for him to come back, and he's all by himself in the school. And he's rejected by his father. And that kind of pain as a child can lead you in directions you don't want to go. Well, he wasn't yet Scrooge. He was still Ebenezer, and he's still a good kid. He's continued to grow up, and then he starts interning for an accountant. And as he's interning for that accountant, the accountant reminds him that the thing you definitely don't want to be in life is poor. And so what you most want to be is rich. And this starts to work on his heart. Now this becomes a value in his life. He's dating a young woman. They're actually engaged. Her name is Belle. And they've been dating for some time, but as Ebenezer Scrooge becomes more and more caught up in wealth and power and possessions, she finds herself thinking, I can't be married to this man. So in the scene that you're about to see here, this is from the 1999 version of A Christmas Carol starring Patrick Stewart. Ebenezer is taken back to his young adulthood in the moment when Belle breaks off the engagement, or offers to break off the engagement, because she doesn't like what she sees in Ebenezer Scrooge. Take a look.
All your nobler hopes are merged into the one hope of being rich. One master passion engulfs you. Money.
What of it? Even if I've grown wiser, I'm not changed towards you, have I?
Our promise to marry is an old one. It was made when we were poor and content to be so until we improved our fortunes. You are changed. When we promised each other, you were another man.
I was a boy.
How often and how keenly I have thought of this, I will not say. But I have thought of it, and can release you from your promise.
No, no. Have I ever asked you to release me?
In words? No, never.
How then?
In your changed nature, in everything that made me love you. If this had never been between us, tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now? No.
You've changed. Your changed nature is not one I can live with forever. And you saw Patrick Stewart as an older man. He's standing there and he's pleading, no! And right after the scene, he says, go after her, but young Patrick Stewart, young Ebenezer Scrooge couldn't do it. Because he was so focused on money and wealth and power. He gave up the love of his life. And he lived to be an old man all by himself in a miserable existence. And he recognizes in that moment, I made a terrible decision. So I had a woman who came to see me some years ago, and she said, Pastor Adam, I've lost my husband. And I thought she meant he had died. I said, when did your husband pass? I'm so sorry. She said, no, I've lost the man I fell in love with. He's changed. He's not the same. He used to be such a good dad. And he was somebody who loved tenderly, and he was so kind. And they got caught up in his career and acquisition of wealth and power and prestige, and somehow he forgot about us. And he no longer treats the children the same way. He no longer cares as deeply as he once did for them. And for me, I feel nothing anymore from him. I want my husband back. And we prayed and talked about things that she might try and what could happen. And he was unwilling to see a counselor or anyone else. And 2 years later, she left a note on the dining room table, took the children to another state, said, I can't do this anymore. It just hurts too much. And now he'd gotten seemingly what he wanted, all the time in the world to spend on his career and on his acquisition of wealth, living in his mini mansion in South Johnson County all by himself. This is what happens sometimes. So the story is about change, and it's about recognizing that sometimes we need to change. And the Christmas story is about helping us see what we were meant to be. And so what I want to remind you of is that all of us are changing all the time. You're changing, I'm changing. We change over time. We're supposed to change, but we're supposed to change in the right way. The question is, are you changing in the right way, or are you changing in the wrong way? I want to ask you this. So today, are you kinder or more cruel than you were 2 years ago, 3 years ago? Are you more patient or impatient than you were before? Do you act more selflessly or more selfishly than you did a year ago or 2 or 3 years ago? And Scripture has this idea that we're supposed to be changing, but the goal of that kind of change is called sanctification, which means to be made holy, to be like God or to be like Jesus, not as powerful like that, but instead just caring, compassionate, kind. We're supposed to be more of that. and less of the selfish, cruel, unkind, impatient person that we might have been. How are you changing now? By the way, I'll mention the word in the Greek New Testament that describes this change that happens in the negative way is hamartia. It's a Greek word that means to miss the mark or stray from the path. So there's a right path, and then you slowly, by degrees, begin heading in the wrong direction. You don't even realize it at first. And the Greek word hamartia is usually translated as sin. It's a word that we don't really know what to do with that. It seems kind of harsh, but hamartia is a really great word to describe what happens to us as we stray away from the right path, as Ebenezer Scrooge did when he moved from Ebenezer to Scrooge. By the way, I want to remind you that Jesus' name in Greek and in Hebrew means God saves. And so the baby whose birth we're celebrating, it wasn't just about a baby, it was about a baby who would grow up to be the Savior, who would rescue us, deliver us, help us to find who we are, and to be who we were meant to be. He came to die for us, to forgive us, but also to show us the depth of God's love. But even before that, he's constantly teaching and modeling for us. This is what it means to be human. This is the right way. That's why in the Christmas carols, we sing not just about a baby, but about a Savior. So, come thou long-expected Jesus, Charles Wesley wrote, born to set thy people free from our fears and sins, release us. Let us find our rest in thee. That takes us to the ghost of Christmas present. And on that night, once more, Ebenezer Scrooge is awakened in the night. His heart is already beginning to change and realizing he's regretting things that he'd done in the past. But now the ghost of Christmas present takes him out, and he's gone to bed early, so it's early in the evening, and he takes him out. He's invisible to the guests in the different homes he goes to. But he goes to, say, his nephew's house, and he hears people talking about him. And Fred, his nephew, had invited him to Christmas Eve every year to dinner, and he would never show up, or Christmas Day he wouldn't come. He didn't want, it was bah humbug for him. By the way, humbug means to see something as a joke or a prank or a hoax or a lie. And that's how he thinks about Christmas. And so they lamented the fact that he was missing out on joy in life. And then he's taken to the home of Bob Cratchit, his lone employee. And when he arrives at that home, he pays him a substandard wage he can hardly survive on. His son, Tiny, do you remember Tiny's name? Tiny Tim. His son, Tiny Tim, is terribly ill, but he doesn't have the funds to be able to help his son get access to medical care. And does Ebenezer Scrooge care? No. He never asks about Bob Cratchit's son. He resents the fact that he has to pay him for a day off on Christmas. He pays him as little as he possibly can. And so he's taken there by the ghost of Christmas present. And what you see in this scene is when he arrives at the house, and again, the Cratchit family can't see him. This is from the 2009 animated Christmas Carol. Scrooge is voiced by Jim Carrey. Take a look.
To Mr. Scrooge, the founder of our feast.
Founder of the feast, indeed. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope to have a good appetite for it.
My dear, you children, it's Christmas time.
Christmas Day, I'm sure. How can one drink the other? Such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows him better than you.
My dear, Christmas Day.
I'll drink his health for your sake, and the day's not for his. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. You'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt.
A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us.
God bless us. God bless us. Everyone.
Merry Christmas. God bless.
Kind spirit, say Tiny Tim will be spared.
If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die.
Die! No, spirit, no.
What's happening to Ebenezer Scrooge? He didn't really care about children who were sick before. In fact, he had this phrase early in the novella that says, "But let them die. It reduces the surplus human population." But now at this point, he's seeing, he's listening, he's hearing things that were said about him that are unpleasant. He's watching what's happening there, and he begins to have a heart that cares for and shows compassion for Tiny Tim and for Bob Cratchit and for his family. He's beginning to lament, to grieve the fact that he had been a part of this man's poverty. And he starts to repent, starts to change the way he sees things, the way he feels, the way he doesn't change yet how he's going to act, but he will by the end of the story. And so when we look at this, part of what we're remembering is that God has the capacity to change our hearts. I mean, Jesus talked about being born again or born anew, and what he meant by that is to be changed from the inside out. Or Ezekiel, the prophet, says this. God says through Ezekiel, "I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit in you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." I've heard from people sometimes, they say things like, well, people can't change. But the gospel says people can change. And we have the ability to be made new from the inside out. And that's what Jesus came to do. That's what he came to do. That's the Christmas story. Not just the birth of a baby, but a baby who transforms our hearts and lives, and through us changes or transforms the world. So I want you to notice one other thing about the Christmas story. In A Christmas Carol, Bob Cratchit begins to care for the poor. And in the Christmas story, you remember that Mary was a peasant girl from the backwaters of Palestine. She grew up in Nazareth, and later on, Jesus was born there. We grew up in Nazareth. You remember Nathanael said of Nazareth, can anything good come out of Nazareth? It was the other side of the tracks. It's where the poor people lived, who served the rich people in the town of Sepphoris. And we find that when Mary finds out that she's going to have the Christ child, she cries out a song, the Magnificat, and in part of it, she says this, she sings this, God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. And what's happening in this song, it's the parallels. It's the poor and the rich. It's the powerful and the powerless. And God is trying to save both. He's trying to save the prideful and the powerful and the rich by bringing them down so they humble themselves, so they might be what God intended for them to be. And he's going to lift up the lowly, and he's going to help them walk away with things that lead them to be well-fed, and he's going to help them understand that they are loved by God and that they have value and meaning in their lives. This is what's going on in the Christmas story, the baby in her womb. And then finally, you remember, they show up in Luke's gospel in Bethlehem. There's no room for them in the inn, and so they end up giving birth in the stable. The stable was where the donkeys were kept. This is a first-century parking garage. That's where Mary and Joseph give birth to the Christ child. You remember that night the angels are invited to come, or the angels invite the shepherds to come. The shepherds were the lowest rung on the socioeconomic ladder in the first century. And God invites them first to come and see the Christ child. And this whole story, Jesus' first sermon, is this: the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor. And so all of this, God is showing his concern for the people who are nobodies, or considered nobodies by their society. The poor and the outcast and the outlaws, the outsiders. And saying they matter to me. And they're meant to matter to you and to me. So in all of this, we find that Ebenezer Scrooge begins to change. He moves from being Scrooge to being Ebenezer, and his heart is filled with compassion. That leads to the last step in his transformation, and that's when the ghost of Christmas Future comes. And the ghost of Christmas Future takes him out in that night. He takes him out to a place where there is a dead body lying in a bed covered with a sheet. And Scrooge wants to know, who is this person? And he has the opportunity to remove the sheet, but he's afraid to, because he's afraid he knows who it is. But it's actually him. He's hearing people talk in town about this man who had just died, and how little love there was for this man, and how people were just looking to see, what can I get from his clothing? Can I get his buttons that I can use on my clothing? What's going to happen to his money, because nobody loved him and he loved nobody? And then finally, the ghost of Christmas Future takes him to the cemetery. And that's what I want you to see in this little clip from the 1901 silent version of the film. Take a look. Scrooge came face to face with his own mortality. I love that old clip just to capture how they made films at that time. But at the same time, this idea that he came face to face with death. And when you do that, it leads you to ask certain existential questions. What is the meaning of life? And why am I here? And what legacy will I leave behind? What mark will I have left on the world? And what happens after we die? And what will happen to me after I die? All of those big questions. Now, as he's asking these questions, and you see that scene there, in the book, we read Ebenezer Scrooge saying to the ghost of Christmas Future, Spirit, hear me, I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life. I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. Remember, for him, Christmas is always humbug. It's just a hoax, not something to be observed. And suddenly now he sees Christmas. He understands what Christmas is. It's life. It's God coming to us in Jesus to show us the way. It's God coming to redeem us and to save us and to rescue us and to change us and to bring light into our lives and hope and to leave us with a changed life and a changed legacy and hope in the face of death. In every one of these services so far, this is, I think, the 6th, or this is the 8th Christmas Eve candlelight service that we've had over the last couple of days. In every one of them, I've run into people that I've known who have lost loved ones, or who I met who had lost loved ones. A woman who was sitting over here who lost her mother and father within 9 days of each other just a few months ago. And a woman who was sitting over here who had lost her aunt, and a woman who helped light the Christ candle who lost her brother, and 2 kids in the narthex that were freshmen and seniors in college at K-State and KU, whose father I buried earlier this year. And over again, these stories, and part of what I remind people of is when we gather here, we're remembering not just the birth of Jesus, but his life, his teachings, his suffering, his death, but also how on the 3rd day he rose from the grave. How he said, I am the resurrection and the life, and those who believe in me will never die. How he said, I go to prepare a place for you, and if I do, I will come back for you, that you might be with me where I am. And so it doesn't take away the sting. I was holding this freshman in college in my arms as she was crying in the narthex, and I said, I know that doesn't make it all okay. I know you miss your dad. But what it does say is that death is not the end, and that your dad is safe. And when you believe that, it helps you cope with the darkness and the grief and the pain. One thing that struck me as I was watching Ebenezer Scrooge was a call I received from the funeral home a number of years ago, probably 20 years ago, and they called and said, Pastor Adam, we have somebody, we need to have a pastor do the funeral. We thought maybe you would be the best one to do this. I said, well, I'm happy to do it. Tell me the story. They said, well, we really don't know her story. I said, okay, well, let me know the family, the next of kin, and I would love to call them and have a chance to go sit down with them. We take our little black notebooks and we sit with them in their home, and we say, tell us, your loved one's story. And they said they don't want to talk to anybody. Okay. They said, in fact, they don't want a service in the funeral chapel. They don't want it at church. They just want to have a simple graveside service. I said, okay, well, we'll figure this out. And they said, and the last thing we want you to know is they're not planning on coming. And all of a sudden I realized there was a lot of pain in this family that was coming in. And I said, well, is there any way I can try? No, we can't. We just can't release the name of the person. I said, okay, well, I'll be there. And we set a time. It was a graveside service. And I've officiated at 350 funerals. It's the only funeral I've ever officiated at where no one came. So I stood at the cemetery at Mount Moriah. There was me and the funeral director on the other side of the casket and the man with the tractor who was going to cover up the grave when he was finished. And we did our best we said, God, you knew this person. We don't know them. We know there's a lot of pain associated with her. But you made her. And there's even dignity, underneath all of that. And so as you gave her to us, we give her to you. We don't know what she said to you in her dying moments, but we're just going to lift up this woman to you. And we're going to pray for her family that there might be healing in the face of this painful situation. It's really such an odd experience. And then I contrasted that with most of the other funerals I've done, like the family I mentioned who was sitting over here, who lost their father, their grandfather, their husband. And when I went to their house and I sat down with the grandkids, and before I could even ask a question, the kids just started talking, just rattling off all these great stories about their papa, what it was like to have him as a grandpa, and then the kids talking about their dad and what he was like, and their mom talking about her husband. And here's one of the things I've noticed in all of these funerals that I've done. I've never once had somebody say, let me tell you how much money my dad made. It was amazing. Or let me tell you about my mom's climbing the career ladder and having the corner office and the C-suite, at the offices there. Nobody says that stuff. You know what they say if they have anything positive to say, and most people do? Is I love how my dad came to my ball games when I was growing up. Or how my papa liked to play with me, made me giggle and laugh. Or how my husband cherished me and made me feel special. That's what they say. So again, because this sermon is not just about Ebenezer Scrooge, but about you, I just want to ask this question. If I show up, or Hemi, or Justin shows up at your family's house after you've passed with our little black notebook, what will your family say about you? And I'm certain they'll say kind things and wonderful things about you, but are there any things that you wish today you might have changed along the way to have been more loving or kind or compassionate? Are there any things in how you live your life, or your priorities, or how you serve other people, or the compassion you show, you wish or you will have wished that you'd done more of? Because this is a redemptive story, the birth of Jesus. It's a redemptive story, Ebenezer Scrooge, but in the end, it's your redemptive story and mine. That's the focus of the Christmas story and the Christmas carol. All right, that just reminds me of one last thing about this is how we sing in the Christmas carols these words. Good Christian men rejoice with heart and soul and voice. Now ye need not fear the grave. Peace, peace, Jesus Christ was born to save. Calls you one and calls you all to gain his everlasting hall. Christ was born to save. Christ was born to save. Ebenezer Scrooge wakes up on Christmas morning and he's a changed man. Right? He's undergone a process that the Greek word for it in the New Testament is metanoia. It means to think differently. And once you've seen the light, you see things differently, you begin to feel differently, your passions change, and then you act differently, and you're a new person. And that's what Christ offers us, the chance to be made new. And that morning, Ebenezer Scrooge woke up, changed, and you see it in the novella, and you see it in the Muppets version of the Christmas Carol. Take a look at the difference between the man you're about to see and the man the sermon began with, the grumpy, angry, unpleasant man. Take a look at what he becomes on Christmas morning.
A gift for me.
Thank you. Thank you. 50 times. And a Merry Christmas.
Here's your turkey, Mr. Scrooge.
Follow me.
With a thankful heart, with an endless joy, with a growing family, every girl and boy will be nephew and niece to me. Nephew and niece to me. Will bring love, hope, and peace to me. Love, hope, and peace to me. Yes, and every night will end, and every day will start with a grateful prayer and a thankful heart.
I wish I had time to play that whole song. It just makes my heart happy when I see it. The possibility of human transformation. What happens when we move from being a Scrooge to being an Ebenezer? I want to end with this one last story. This morning at 10 a.m. we had our children's service. We had a ton of kids and their families here. It was really fun, about 1,000 children. And as they were walking in after the service was over with, I stood outside in the narthex and I'm just greeting people. And when I saw kids, I'd ask them questions like, what are you hoping for, Christmas? Or what did you ask Santa for? And I have two little kids who came up, a brother and a sister. And I asked them, what did you want for Christmas? It was Danielle and Emma. And what they told me just took my breath away. And this is a picture of them right here. So there's Daniel and there's Emma. And I asked I asked Emma. I said, Emma, what did you ask for Christmas from Santa Claus? And she said, dog toys. And I thought, she wants a puppy. And I said, are you hoping for a puppy? No, I asked Santa to send dog toys to the shelter for the dogs that don't have people who love them. And I said, Daniel, what did you ask for Christmas? And he said, I asked that Santa would take the Christmas presents he was going to bring for me and take them to the children of Operation Breakthrough so they could have a good Christmas this year. And I stood there amazed. I said, can I get your picture? Because I want to tell your story to everyone else. Because this is what it looks like to be an Ebenezer. There's a Scrooge and an Ebenezer in all of you. And I want to ask you this question. Which will you be in your head? Would you pray with me? And I'd love to invite you to just whisper this prayer to God under your breath. God, thank you for loving me. Thank you for sending Jesus, born in poverty, grew up to look for the lost sheep, to care for the nobodies, and to save us as humans. Jesus, please change me. Help me be an Ebenezer. Help me to come back to your path, to be the person you made me to be. In your holy name, amen. We're going to light the candles in just a moment, but before we do that, we're going to receive an offering. And the wise men brought their gifts to the Christ child on that day when they came, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I want you to know this service is a gift to you. Nothing that you give to the church tonight is going to stay with the church. 100% of what we receive in the Candlelight offerings are going to benefit children living in poverty and their families. Half of it stays here in Kansas City. Half of it goes into developing countries among the poorest of the poor in the world. And as we do that, I've asked our congregation, so I'm not asking this of you, if you're a visitor here, but for our congregation, starting 2 months ago, I said, what would happen if you gave an amount in the Christmas Eve offering equal to what you spent on your entire family for Christmas? You struggle to find things your children need. They already have too much. We try to figure out for each other, what we're going to give when we really don't need anything at all. But there are people here living within 30 minutes of this church, and some much closer than that, who don't have anything, or very little. And so, we have usually between 1,000 and 2,000 households in our congregation who give an amount equal to what they spend on their own family. Lavon and I do that, and a whole host of other people do. We just figure out, what do we spend on Christmas gifts? We're going to give at least that amount on the Christmas Eve offering. I'm not asking that of you, but here's what I might suggest, is there are children who get nothing, and if you think about, well, what do I spend on an average gift for somebody in my family? Is it $30? Maybe there's 4 of you sitting here today. What would happen if you gave 4 $30 gifts in the offering today? $120. Now that may not be possible for some of you, and for some of you, your average gift is $50, and so maybe you multiply it that way. And some of you couldn't afford to do any of that, and that's okay too. Maybe you can't do anything. That's all right. Other people do it, and it'll be okay. Last year on Christmas Eve, we gave $2.5 million for projects benefiting children and families in poverty. This year we have 26 projects and 26 partners we're going to work with, and I wanted you to see just 2 of the 26. One in Malawi, a sliver of a country in South Central Africa. I've been there, many of our people have been there. And the other is Operation Breakthrough at 31st and Troost. Take a look.
Zoe is a 3-year program where they take children that have absolutely nothing and not only give them an opportunity to have a job, have secure housing, education, hygiene, teach them child rights, but they give them, and this is actually the most important part, they give them hope. So Zoe goes in and identifies children that are the most vulnerable, the ones that may have no parents, they have no home, they have no food, and those are the children they invite to this program. When they first start in the program, their very first year, they won't look at you. They look down, they're shamed, they have no hope. But when you then meet children that are either graduating from the program, so they're in their 3rd year, or they're a graduate, it's incredible the difference. So this Candlelight Christmas Eve, we have an opportunity to do this with 400 more children in Malawi, and we're going to expand into a new partnership into Uganda.
So our mission is to provide a safe, nurturing educational environment for children in poverty and to empower their parents through emergency aid, assistance, advocacy, and education. Sometimes we see that our children will have much higher percentages of simple things like experience with violence inside or outside the home, incarceration of a parent, loss of a parent. Many of our families are working, yet average income is only about $12,000 per year. Most of the families are single parent households, yet they're some of the most resilient families that I know. They're oftentimes working through difficult choices. It's not as simple as, can I provide food or housing? We have 405 children in our early care and preschool programming, and then as they enter kindergarten, they can move into our before and after school program where we're serving another 250 to 300 children. And basically when school's out, we're in. It keeps parents working, but it makes sure kids have what they need to succeed. We are so grateful for everyone who's participating in the Christmas Eve Candlelight services, because those gifts are going to change lives.
Here's how you can give tonight if you'd like to. They're offering envelopes, the seat back of the chair in front of you. You can put cash or checks in there. You can leave it in the back of the room. The basket's there. You can use your phone. This is the easiest way. This is how most of us give. And we text the message COR to 77977. COR is Church of Resurrection. 77977. And when you send COR to 77977, you get a link back. You can click on the link, and then you can give using your credit card if you wish to, or a debit card. And I just want to encourage you tonight. Let's be these kids stones of help. Let's be their Ebenezers, and let's make a difference in the world. And we're going to find joy as we do. So I invite you to give generously, and I invite you now to listen carefully for O Holy Night.